Welcome back to Pop Flashback. I'm Rick Smalls.
And I'm Tina Boucher.
And today, Tina, we are taking a deep dive into a time when the U.S. government feared comic books.
They did. It's kind of a wild chapter in pop culture history.
It really is. When you think about it now, it's like comic books.
Right. But in the 1950s, there was a genuine concern.
So, like, what were people so afraid of back then?
Well, there was this moral panic surrounding comics.
Moral panic.
Yeah. People worried about all the violence and the crime, the horror. And they were convinced that it would lead to, like, juvenile delinquency.
So a real societal breakdown.
Exactly. A complete breakdown of society, all because of comic books.
Okay, so this wasn't just a couple of parents, like, complaining.
Oh, no. This was a full-blown national freakout.
Wow. So tell me, what were some of the comics that people were most worried about?
Well, there were a few different types. Horror comics.
Okay, those make sense.
Yeah.
Like super gory stuff.
Yeah, stuff like Tales from the Crypt.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, they pushed the boundaries back then with, like, gruesome stories and artwork.
Yeah, I could see how those would have been controversial. Anything else?
Crime comics were a big target, too.
Oh, yeah, like gangsters and stuff.
Exactly, especially the ones that made crime seem, well, cool.
I could see how that could be a concern.
And even some superhero comics raised eyebrows.
Really? How so?
Well, some had violence and suggestive themes.
Okay, I can see that being an issue in the 50s.
Right.
So with all this concern and controversy, like, what happened?
Well, they almost ended up with government censorship.
Really? Wow.
But the comic book industry decided to take action.
They did.
Yeah, they formed the Comics Magazine Association of America.
Oh, the CMAA.
Yep, in 1954, they formed the CMAA as a way to self-regulate.
So to avoid government intervention, basically.
Oh, exactly.
Okay, so what did they do?
They created the Comics Code Authority, the CCA.
Ah, the infamous CCA.
It was their way of, well, kind of policing themselves.
So what were these rules they came up with?
Well, the 1954 version was very strict.
Uh-huh.
They banned excessive violence, depictions of crime that glamorized criminals, and horror was heavily restricted.
Wow, they really cracked down.
They did. Even the way women were drawn was regulated.
Really?
Yeah, no suggestive illustrations. Female characters had to be drawn, quote, realistically.
So big change from what we see today.
For sure. And, like, some of those popular horror and crime comics we talked about earlier, they were hit hard.
Oh, I bet. What happened to them?
Many titles were just canceled
Wow.
because they couldn't comply with the code. Others were toned down.
So the entire industry basically reshaped itself.
Yeah, the Comics Code was a major turning point in comic book history.
Wow. So how did creators deal with these restrictions?
Well, some found creative ways to work around them, but for many, it was a frustrating time.
So these strict rules that they put in place, did they ever, like, loosen up over time?
They did eventually, but it was a very slow process.
Okay.
The first big changes actually came in 1971.
Oh, okay. So what did they change?
Well, they started allowing things like depictions of some criminal activity and corruption, as long as, the bad guys were always punished in the end.
So a little more grit and realism.
Exactly, but still within boundaries.
Right, right. What about the horror comics? Any changes there?
Yeah, they started allowing some supernatural creatures back in.
Oh, really?
Like vampires and werewolves.
Interesting.
But there was a catch. They had to be handled in a classic literary tradition.
So, like, think Dracula or Frankenstein.
Exactly.
So they were easing up on the horror, but still with, like, some rules.
Yeah, for example, zombies were still a no-go.
No zombies. Why not?
They weren't considered literary enough, apparently.
So the CCA was slowly becoming more lenient, but were there any, like, big pushbacks during this time?
There were definitely some challenges. One really interesting case involved Marvel Comics and a storyline about drug abuse.
Drug abuse. In a comic book?
Yeah, it was actually at the request of the government.
Really?
Yeah, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, they approached Marvel in the early 70s.
Oh, okay.
And they asked them to create a story about the dangers of drugs.
That's interesting.
Stan Lee, he was the editor-in-chief at Marvel at the time, he agreed and wrote this 3-part Spider-Man story.
The Spider-Man. Okay, so using a popular character to, like, send a message.
Exactly.
What was the problem then?
The CCA, they refused to approve it.
What? Why?
They said that any depiction of drug use, even if it was anti-drug, violated the code.
Oh, wow, they really missed the point there.
Yeah, they did. So Stan Lee, he was determined to publish the story anyway.
He was.
He felt it was important.
Okay, but that was a big risk, right? Going against the CCA.
It was, but he did it. He published the Spider-Man drug storyline without their approval.
Wow. And what happened?
It was a huge success. Readers loved it, and it got a lot of public support.
Okay.
And the CCA, they faced so much backlash for their decision.
So they had to change their tune.
They did. They ended up revising the code to allow depictions of drug use, but only if it was presented as, a vicious habit.
Wow. So this Spider-Man storyline actually led to a change in the comics code.
It did. It's amazing how one story can have such a big impact.
That's incredible. It just shows you that even a system like the comic code could evolve, even if it took some public pressure to make it happen.
Exactly. And this wasn't the last time the code would be challenged and revised. As we move into the 80s and 90s, things really start to change.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, publishers started to push the boundaries even more and question the whole idea of the CCA in a changing world.
That's a story for next time, though. But we're out of time for this part. All right, so we've been talking about the Comics Code Authority and its impact on the comic book industry.
Yeah, we've seen how it came about, the restrictions it imposed, and how it even started to loosen up a bit over time.
Right, right. But what ultimately happened to it? Like, is it still around today?
Well, no, it's actually defunct. It doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, really? So when did it finally fade away?
Well, things really started to shift in the late 80s and early 90s. Publishers were starting to push back more and more.
They were.
Yeah, like DC Comics and Now Comics, they began experimenting with more mature content.
Mm-hmm.
Content that really pushed the boundaries of what the CCA considered acceptable.
So, like, what were some examples of this pushback?
Well, there's one that stands out, Swamp Thing, issue number 29 from 1984.
Swamp Thing, okay.
Yeah, the CCA actually refused to give it their seal of approval.
But they published it anyway.
They did. DC went ahead and published it without the code's blessing.
Wow, that's pretty bold. What was so controversial about that issue?
Well, it had mature themes and a darker tone than what the CCA was used to.
I see. So they were willing to risk losing distribution just to tell the stories they wanted to tell.
Yeah, basically. And Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns came out a couple of years later.
Oh, yeah, those are classics.
And they also pushed the boundaries of the code with their darker, more complex themes.
It seems like the CCA was losing its grip on the industry.
Yeah, and it continued into the 2000s. In 2001, Marvel actually stopped submitting their comics to the CCA altogether.
Wow, that's a big deal. What happened?
They had a disagreement over an issue of X-Force. The CCA wanted changes that Marvel wasn't willing to make.
So Marvel just said, forget it.
Pretty much. And, after that, other publishers followed suit. By 2011, all the major publishers had abandoned the code.
So it just kind of died out.
It did. It became completely irrelevant.
Wow, what a journey. From trying to avoid government censorship to basically becoming obsolete.
It really shows you how much the world of comics has changed over the decades and, how important creative freedom is for artists and writers.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the history of the Comics Code Authority.
Yeah, it was a fascinating look at a really unique chapter in pop culture history.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. We'll catch you next time.